Story number 1.
I'd been driving for close to 10 hours when I saw the first sign for the motel. My legs ached from the cramped position behind the wheel, and my eyes were starting to blur from the long stretch of darkness that made the rural highway feel endless. I was somewhere in the middle of Kansas, surrounded by open farmland, no cell service, and a gas gauge just above empty. The sign was old and crooked, lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb. Silver Pine Motel, clean beds, vacancy. There wasn't another building in sight, not even a barn or a gas station, but I didn't have many choices left. The motel sat about half a mile off the main road, accessible only by a narrow dirt path lined with tall, black trees. My headlights cut through the dust kicked up by my tires, and as I got closer, I started to regret it. The place looked like it had been forgotten for decades. 2 rows of rooms in an L shape, a small office with a dusty window, and a vending machine that had been cracked open and emptied. I parked and went to the front office. The inside smelled faintly of mold and something bitter, like burnt coffee left on too long. A woman in her late 60s sat behind the counter, her gray hair pulled back tight and her eyes bloodshot. She didn't look up right away, just scribbled something into a ledger and slid it toward me. "Cash only?" she muttered. I handed her $60. She gave me a room key, an actual metal key attached to a cracked plastic tag that read room 3. "No loud noises after midnight," she said without emotion. "And don't bother the other guests." "There are other guests?" I asked, peering out the window. Every room looked dark. She didn't answer, just turned her chair toward the small TV behind her and clicked the volume up. Room 3 was on the far end of the first row. The paint was peeling and the door stuck when I pushed it open. The room was small and smelled like it hadn't been used in a long time. The bed sagged in the middle, the carpet had suspicious dark stains, and the curtains didn't quite close all the way. I pulled them together as best I could and dropped onto the mattress, too tired to care. I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like someone dragging their nails along the outside of the wall. Then it moved. The sound slid from one side of the room to the other, slow and deliberate, as if something was crawling just behind the plaster. I sat up, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything over the silence. Then I heard it again, but this time it was coming from the bathroom. A soft, wet slapping noise, like something moving on the tile floor. I got up, turned on the lamp, and walked toward the bathroom door. The noise stopped as soon as I put my hand on the knob. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, trying to work up the courage to open it. Finally, I pushed it open and flipped the light. Nothing. The bathroom was empty. Damp, but empty. I figured it had to be a rat. Maybe the walls were just thin and I was hearing plumbing or something outside. I went back to bed, telling myself not to be paranoid. But then at exactly 3:17 a.m., there was a knock at the door. It was 3 short knocks, evenly spaced. Then silence. I sat frozen. The hallway outside had no lights, no cameras, no way to tell who was out there. I thought about calling the front office, but my phone still had no service. Another knock. 3 taps, a little harder this time. I didn't answer. I just sat there, heart pounding, until it stopped. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up to the early morning sun peeking through the curtain gap. I got dressed quickly and decided to check out. I didn't care about breakfast or a refund. I just wanted to be back on the road. When I got to the office, it was locked. The woman was gone, the TV was off, and there was no note. I banged on the door for a few minutes before giving up. I decided to leave the key on the counter and get out of there. As I turned back toward my car, I saw room 5's door slowly close. It had been slightly ajar, just enough that I could see the edge of a shadow move inside. I froze. I hadn't seen any other vehicles in the lot, and the other rooms all looked abandoned. I crept toward room 5 and pressed my ear to the door. No sound. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the window. It was quick, like a reflection or a shape just out of frame, but it made my stomach drop. Someone was standing behind the curtain. I could see their feet, pale and bare, just beneath the hem of the fabric. They didn't move, just stood there facing the window. I didn't stick around. I got in my car and drove off, the dust from the lot billowing behind me like smoke. Back on the road, I started to feel a little better. The sun was fully up, the sky clear, and the radio finally found a station. It was like the whole night had been a bad dream. Until I stopped at a diner 2 towns over to get breakfast and use the restroom. When I looked in the mirror, I saw something written in black ink across the back of my neck. Don't knock! Don't knock! I scrubbed at it hard, but it didn't come off. I had no idea how it got there. I hadn't fallen asleep against anything, hadn't used a pen, hadn't seen anyone else in that motel. That was 4 years ago. The writing faded after a couple of days, but the nightmares didn't. They always start the same. I'm in a motel, sometimes the same one, sometimes different, but the layout's always familiar. Room 3, peeling paint, a sagging mattress, then the scratching starts, then the knocks, always 3, always at 3:17 a.m. Sometimes I open the door in the dream. When I do, I wake up screaming, covered in sweat. I never remember what I see, only that it's wrong. Not a person, not an animal, something in between. I've tried looking up the motel again, Silver Pine Motel, Kansas. I've checked every travel site, every map, every forum. Nothing. Like it was erased. Or maybe like it was never there in the first place. But I know it was. I kept the key. It's in a drawer in my desk, still cold to the touch even in summer. The tag's worn now, the plastic brittle, but the number is still visible. Room 3. I've moved twice since then. Changed my number. Got a new car. But sometimes, when I drive late at night on unfamiliar highways, I think I see a familiar sign out of the corner of my eye. Just a flash. Like a memory trying to become real again. And every now and then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., I wake up to the sound of knocking. Always 3. Always from inside the walls. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It had been a long day of driving, and I was desperate to stop. I had been on the road for over 10 hours, heading toward a job interview in a city I didn't really care to visit. I hadn't planned to drive so far, but I didn't want to deal with the hassle of booking a hotel or flying. I wanted the freedom of the road, even if it meant arriving at my destination exhausted. The sun had already set, and the rain started as I passed through a small town with no real landmark to speak of. My phone had died hours ago, and the car's battery was struggling to stay alive. I looked around for a place to stop. There were no big hotels in sight, only a few smaller, older buildings on the outskirts of town. One of them caught my eye, the Whispering Pines Motel, its neon sign barely glowing against the heavy rain. I pulled into the lot, driving past a handful of cars parked haphazardly. The place looked abandoned, and the lights in the windows were dim, flickering occasionally like it was struggling to stay on. But I didn't have many options. I was too tired to keep driving, and I was hoping this place would be decent enough to crash for the night. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and walked to the office. The door opened with a groan as I stepped inside. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cleaning chemicals, the kind of mix that immediately makes you wonder about the last time anyone cleaned the place properly. The front desk was empty, but there was a bell on the counter. I rang it. A moment later, the door to the back opened, and an older woman stepped out. She was thin, with long gray hair pulled into a messy bun, and she wore a faded floral dress. Her skin was pale, almost as though she hadn't seen the sun in years. She looked me over, her eyes scanning me slowly. "You need a room?" she asked in a slow, raspy voice. I nodded. Just for the night, she smiled, a thin, tight smile, and reached behind her to pull out a key. It was attached to a brass tag, the number 10 engraved on it. "Room 10, you'll find it at the end of the row, near the trees." I took the key from her and thanked her. As I turned to leave, she spoke again. "No one stays in the rooms beyond the trees," she said, her voice low. "They're not safe." I wasn't sure if she meant it literally or if it was some sort of strange warning, but I nodded and stepped outside, shivering in the cold rain. The air felt thick, and the sky overhead seemed too dark, even for a storm. I hurried to my car, trying not to let the discomfort of the place get to me. Room 10 was exactly as she had said, at the very end of the row, surrounded by a patch of trees that seemed to close in on the motel like a dark wall. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room wasn't much. Old furniture, a lumpy bed with a comforter that looked like it hadn't been washed in a while. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and there were stains on the carpet that hadn't been cleaned in years. The dim light flickered overhead, and I noticed the window was cracked open a few inches, letting in the damp night air. I set my bag on the bed and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. I needed sleep. I couldn't afford to keep driving. But sleep wouldn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the sound of the rain tapping against the window was replaced by an eerie, distant creaking sound. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something in the trees outside. The noise was rhythmic, almost like someone walking slowly along the edge of the motel, their footsteps heavy, but with no one there. I pulled the blanket up around my shoulders, trying to ignore the sound, but it only grew louder, closer. My heart rate quickened, and I got up to look out the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer outside. The darkness beyond the trees was thick, but I thought I saw movement, a figure just beyond the reach of the light, moving through the trees. I squinted, trying to make out the shape, but the figure seemed to vanish into the shadows, leaving nothing but the trees rustling in the wind. I slammed the curtain shut, my pulse racing. I was just tired, I told myself. It was nothing, a figment of my imagination. But the noise continued. It wasn't until I finally forced myself to get back into bed and shut my eyes that I heard it. A soft knocking, barely audible at first, but it was unmistakable. Knocking, coming from the wall next to my bed. I froze, unable to move. The knock came again, and then another, each one closer to the door. There was no one on the other side of the wall. The only thing on the other side was the woods. I jumped up, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked over to the door, unlocking it. The cool air hit me as I stepped outside, looking down the row of rooms. The only sound was the distant hum of the wind. No one was there. I looked around, my breath fogging in the cold air, but the place was still. Nothing moved, no footsteps, no creaking, nothing. I thought I heard a rustle behind me and turned quickly. There, in the shadows at the edge of the trees, was a figure. The figure stood still, just beyond the motel, watching me. Its shape was indistinct, cloaked in darkness, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. It felt as though I was frozen in place, trapped by something beyond my control. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to look away and rush back inside, locking the door behind me. The knocking started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from the window. I turned toward the window, my breath shallow. I didn't want to look. I knew what I would see. I turned the light off, hoping to hide in the dark, but the figure outside remained. It was closer now, standing just under the window, its features still obscured by the night. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else, but I knew it was there, and it was watching me. The knocking continued. I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed my phone, dialing the front desk, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message, urging someone to come check on me, but I knew it was pointless. The woman at the front desk had already warned me that no one stayed in the rooms beyond the trees. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It was now coming from every corner of the room, as though the walls themselves were breathing, closing in on me. I couldn't stay in this room any longer. I grabbed my bag, barely thinking, and rushed outside. The rain had picked up again, and the trees loomed around me like dark sentinels. I didn't care about the car anymore. I just needed to leave, to get away from this place, from whatever was out there. But when I reached the road, I realized my car was gone. The parking lot was empty. The entire motel was abandoned. I stood there, stunned, my mind racing. It didn't make sense. There had been cars parked here just hours ago. I had parked right next to room 10. I heard the rustling again, and this time it was closer. Too close. I spun around, but the trees were empty. There was no figure, no sign of life, only the endless darkness of the woods. And then a voice, whispering from somewhere behind me, too faint to understand, but filled with the kind of terror that made my skin crawl. I didn't look back. I ran. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was on the highway, a few miles down the road, my car parked at a gas station, but I could still hear the knocking. Even now, I hear it sometimes. It's always coming from somewhere beyond the trees. Story the end.
Story number 3.
Mark had never liked driving at night, but a client emergency forced him to take the highway long after sunset. He was somewhere in western Arizona, past the familiar towns and fast food clusters, on a 2-lane road that seemed to stretch into nothing. His GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and the fuel gauge blinked low just as the last traces of twilight disappeared behind the desert hills. It was then that he noticed a flickering neon sign off the side of the road. Motel Linwood, vacancy. The building sat isolated, partially hidden behind overgrown shrubs, with a gravel driveway that wound through a collapsed fence. A single flickering light hung above the front office. The main structure was long and low, a row of rooms connected by a concrete walkway. It looked forgotten, like time had passed it by decades ago. Still, Mark didn't have much choice. He pulled into the lot and parked his rental car near the office, his headlights illuminating a cracked window and a faded red open sign hanging askew in the corner. He stepped inside, the bell over the door jingling flatly. The lobby smelled of mildew and dust. Behind the counter sat an old man with deeply sunken eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just stared. "Hey, one room, just for the night," Mark said, setting his credit card on the counter. The old man glanced down at the card, then back up. "No cards, cash only." Mark hesitated, then pulled out a crumpled $100 bill. The man took it without a word and handed him a tarnished key with a plastic tag labeled Room 9. As Mark turned to leave, the man finally spoke, his voice raspy. "Don't open the curtains." Mark turned around. "What? Doesn't matter what you see." "Don't open the curtains." Room 9 was at the end of the row. As he walked down the corridor, Mark passed windows covered with heavy drapes. Most of the rooms looked empty, their doors slightly ajar or their handles rusted. A faint buzz came from a broken street lamp overhead, and the desert wind howled against the corners of the building. The key stuck in the lock, but he jiggled it until it turned. The room smelled stale, like it hadn't been used in years. The decor was straight from another era. Faded floral wallpaper, a boxy TV with knobs, a yellowed telephone, and a stiff twin bed with a sagging middle. The curtains were thick and dark green, drawn tightly shut. He sat on the edge of the bed and checked his phone again. Still no signal. No Wi-Fi either. The TV buzzed with static when he turned it on. He shut it off after a few seconds and sat back in silence. He thought about going to bed, but something about the place felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, just off. Like the walls were listening. It started around midnight. Mark had just started to drift off when he heard it. A tapping sound. Faint, deliberate. It came from the window. Tap, tap, tap. He sat up and stared at the curtains. The tapping came again, and this time he was sure it was a finger. He could imagine it, one single finger rapping gently against the glass. He remembered what the old man had said. "Don't open the curtains." But Mark wasn't superstitious. He figured maybe someone was lost or drunk or trying to get his attention. He stood and approached the window, hesitated for a moment, and then parted the curtains just a few inches. No one there. Just the parking lot, bathed in the dull glow of his car's headlights, still pointed toward the office. Then something moved. A shadow. At the edge of the lot. A shape tall and narrow, stepping just out of sight behind the dumpster. Mark shut the curtain quickly. He tried to sleep again, telling himself it was a trick of the light, maybe a vagrant, maybe an animal. But the tapping came back, this time softer, slower. Tap, tap, tap. He turned on the TV just to drown it out, letting the static fill the room while he buried himself under the blanket. He finally drifted off around 3 a.m. When he woke, it was cold, the kind of cold that didn't match the desert weather outside. His breath fogged slightly in front of his face. The TV was off. The room was completely silent. Then he heard it again. Not tapping, whispering. He sat up straight. The sound was coming from the window, or maybe just beyond it, a soft, breathy voice murmuring words he couldn't understand. It almost sounded like someone trying to pray or recite something, over and over. Mark stared at the curtains, his heartbeat loud in his ears. He wanted to look. He told himself not to. He thought about the old man's warning, but he was freezing, sweating, panicking. He moved to the window and slowly pulled the curtain aside. Nothing there, except a pale handprint smeared across the outside of the glass. It looked wet, like someone had pressed their palm there recently. Mark backed away slowly and grabbed his keys. He didn't care if it was the middle of the night. He was leaving. Now, he opened the door and stopped. The parking lot was gone. In its place was darkness. Not night, not the regular dark of an empty street, but a thick black void, like the world beyond the doorway had been erased. No stars, no lights, no ground, just nothing. He shut the door fast and stumbled backward, nearly falling over the bed. He waited for the light of dawn, but it didn't come. Time stopped working. His phone still showed 3:23 a.m. every time he looked. The whispers turned to knocking, then footsteps. He could hear them pacing just outside the room. Slow, deliberate, dragging footsteps that moved past his door, paused, and then returned again. Over and over. He jammed the desk chair under the doorknob and sat on the bed, clutching the useless phone. He tried the TV again. Static. He picked up the phone on the nightstand. Dead. He shouted through the walls. No response. The whispering changed. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the room, in the corners, behind the walls, under the floor. He heard multiple voices now, overlapping, talking nonsense syllables like chants or a ritual. He curled up in the bed and shut his eyes, trying to block it all out. Sometime later, minutes, hours, the door creaked open on its own. He had locked it. He was sure he had. But the chair was on its side, and the door stood slightly ajar. Beyond it, only darkness. Mark didn't move, didn't breathe. Then a shadow crossed the doorway. Not a person. A figure, but stretched, distorted. Too tall, head too long, arms that reached almost to the floor. It didn't walk, it floated. It stopped in the doorway and turned toward him. Mark felt something press into his chest. Not physical, but heavy, like his soul was being yanked out through his ribs. His vision dimmed, his ears rang. Then it vanished. And suddenly, it was morning. Light streamed through the crack in the curtains. Birds chirped outside. His phone buzzed. It had signal again. The room looked normal. No handprint on the glass, no overturned chair, just the faintest smell of smoke in the air. Mark didn't waste time. He grabbed his bag, ran to his car, and floored it down the gravel path, tires spraying dust behind him. He didn't stop until he reached the next gas station, 20 miles down the highway. The clerk there raised an eyebrow when Mark stumbled in, wild-eyed and shaking. "You okay, man?" The clerk asked. Mark nodded. Just stayed at that old motel up the road." The clerk tilted his head. "What motel?" "Linwood. Place with the neon sign." The clerk's face changed. "There's no motel out there," he said. "Been abandoned for years, burned down back in the 80s. Some real weird stuff went on there. Whole place went up with folks still inside. Nobody really knows what happened." Mark didn't reply. He just stood there. The smell of smoke still lingered in his clothes. That night back in his hotel in Phoenix, he unpacked his bag. Inside, under his clean clothes, was a single item he didn't pack. A room key. Plastic tag. Room 9. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was one of those long, silent stretches of highway that seems to exist purely to test your patience and your tank of gas. Ava had been driving since noon, and now the sun had already dipped under the horizon, leaving a faint purple trail that was quickly swallowed by darkness. Her hands ached from gripping the steering wheel, and her eyes burned from staring at the road. The last sign she passed had promised a motel in 5 miles. She hadn't seen a single car for at least 30. Her GPS had long since given up trying to track her location, but she finally saw a flicker of light ahead, an old neon sign that read, "Rest Easy Inn." The red and white glow buzzed faintly, part of the E flickering like a dying firefly. Ava pulled into the gravel lot, dust swirling up around her headlights. The place looked deserted. 2 cars, one rusted pickup, and a dusty old sedan sat parked crookedly outside. The office was a single square room with a glass door and a paper sign that read, "Ring bell for service." Ava hesitated, then grabbed her bag and walked in. A bell chimed above her head, but no one came. The room smelled like mildew and cigarettes. There were old, yellowing newspapers stacked in the corner and a fan spinning weakly behind the front desk. On the counter sat a silver bell. Ava pressed it once. A minute passed before a door creaked open behind the desk and a man shuffled in. He looked to be in his late 60s, with stringy gray hair and a half-buttoned flannel shirt. His eyes were pale, unfocused, like he wasn't all there. "You need a room?" he asked, voice hoarse like he hadn't used it in days. "Yeah, just for the night. I'm driving cross-country," she said, fishing out her wallet. He didn't ask for ID, just slid a key toward her across the counter. Room 6, end of the hall. Ava looked at the key. It was an actual metal key with a cracked plastic tag attached. She glanced behind him. The hallway was dimly lit, and the carpet looked like it hadn't been vacuumed in years. She thanked him, took the key, and walked to her room. The corridor was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that buzzes in your ears. Room 6 was at the very end, just like he said. The door stuck before it opened, and the inside wasn't much better. There was a single bed with a threadbare cover, a small TV on a stand, and a stained armchair in the corner. The bathroom smelled faintly of bleach and something sour underneath. Still, it was better than sleeping in her car. She sat on the bed, checking her phone. No signal. No Wi-Fi either. She sighed and kicked off her shoes. There was a stack of old magazines on the nightstand, TV guides from the 90s, and a few faded tabloids. She turned on the TV. It buzzed with static before settling on a local news station that looked like it was playing from a VHS tape. "Storm's coming tonight," said the anchor, his voice strangely distorted. "Low visibility. Better stay inside." She clicked the TV off. By the time she got under the covers, the wind had picked up outside. The trees scratched against the window like they were trying to get in. She dozed off eventually, lulled by the white noise of the wind and the occasional creak of the building settling. Somewhere around 2 a.m., she woke up to the sound of someone walking. It was slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. The hallway outside was carpeted, but she could still hear the faint creak of footsteps. They stopped in front of her door. She held her breath. Knock. Knock. It wasn't loud, just soft, polite taps. She froze. Maybe it was the old man from the front desk. Maybe he needed something. But there was no reason for him to knock in the middle of the night. She stayed quiet. The knocking continued. 5 taps, a pause, then another 5. She sat up in bed, heart pounding. "Who is it?" she called out, trying to sound braver than she felt. Silence. Then the knob turned. It rattled gently, like someone testing it. She got out of bed, quietly tiptoeing over. She didn't want to open it, but she had to look. She peered through the peephole. No one was there. She stepped back, confused. Then, just as she turned toward the bed again, she heard it. A faint whisper, right at her door. "You shouldn't be here." Ava's blood went cold. She turned the deadbolt and checked it 3 times before backing away. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, she packed up quickly and went to the front desk. The man was gone. In his place was a younger woman with short hair and tired eyes. She looked up from a crossword puzzle. "Checking out?" "Yeah," Ava said. "Can I ask, was someone knocking on doors last night?" The woman stared at her. "Why? I just heard someone. I don't know. Thought maybe it was security or..." "There is no security." The woman stood up slowly and came around the counter. "What room were you in?" 6. She went pale. "Are you sure?" "Yeah, why?" She hesitated. "No one's supposed to be in that room." Ava blinked. "What?" "It's been closed since last year. After the last guest, something happened." "What happened?" The woman licked her lips. "He checked in, didn't check out. We found him in the bathroom, door locked from the inside. No signs of struggle, but the way his face looked..." She stopped herself. "That room's not supposed to be rented. He must have given you the wrong key." "I saw someone outside the door," Ava said. "He whispered to me." The woman didn't speak for a moment. Then, "You should go." Ava didn't argue. She left without even getting a receipt. As she walked to her car, she looked back at the motel. Room 6's curtain was drawn now, but behind it, she swore she saw a figure standing motionless, staring straight at her. The drive was quiet again, long and empty, but she didn't stop until the sun was high in the sky. She found a gas station 50 miles away and pulled in to fill up. Inside, the cashier was flipping through a newspaper. When he saw her, he nodded politely. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Just passed through a place called Rest Easy Inn," she said, more to herself than him. He stopped flipping. "That place still open?" "Yeah, sort of." He shook his head. "Shouldn't be. My cousin used to be a deputy in that county. Place has a bad history. People go missing out there." Ava felt her skin crawl. What kind of people? All kinds. Guests, workers, even a cop once. Folks say they hear voices at night, see people who aren't supposed to be there. She didn't respond, just took her receipt and left. That night, she stayed in a chain motel off the interstate. Clean, bright, and safe. But when she closed her eyes, all she could see was that hallway. All she could hear was those 5 soft knocks. She never took the back highways again. Years later, Ava found herself recounting the story to a friend over drinks. They laughed nervously, said it sounded like a movie. But that night, while brushing her teeth, she heard it again, faint but clear, just behind her bathroom door. Knock, 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 knock. She opened the door slowly. No one was there, but in the mirror behind her, Something moved that wasn't her reflection. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was close to midnight when Aaron pulled off the interstate. He'd been driving for hours, his phone's GPS frozen somewhere around 2 exits back. The rain had started about 20 minutes ago, and by now it was coming down in thick sheets, turning the road into a dark mirror. His windshield wipers struggled to keep up, slapping back and forth with a tired, irregular rhythm. His gas light had come on 10 miles ago. The sign appeared like something conjured out of the dark, white neon humming faintly beneath the heavy rain. Eagle Crest Motel, vacancy. It looked like the kind of place that should have been torn down decades ago. Half the letters on the sign were either flickering or burnt out completely. The parking lot was cracked and full of puddles, surrounded by waist-high weeds. Aaron sighed and pulled into a spot under the crooked awning near the office. He sat for a moment in the car, watching the rain splash across the cracked windshield, the yellow of the overhead light casting deep shadows on the hood. He hadn't seen another car in over an hour. He grabbed his backpack from the passenger seat and made a dash for the office door. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mildew. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling in the corners, and a dusty ceiling fan spun lazily overhead. Behind the counter sat an old man, hunched and pale, with thick glasses and a yellowed undershirt. He looked up slowly, as if Aaron had interrupted a long sleep. "Looking for a room?" the man asked, voice gravelly. "Yeah, just for the night." The man pulled out a ledger and opened it to a blank page. Name? Aaron Blake. He wrote it down with a trembling hand and slid over a rusted key attached to a wooden fob labeled Room 6. Cash only. Aaron handed him a crumpled 50. "No guests," the old man muttered. "No noise. You leave before sunrise." Aaron raised an eyebrow. "Before sunrise?" The man didn't respond. He simply turned to a small black and white TV behind him, the screen glowing with static, and turned up the volume. Aaron stood there for a moment, waiting to see if he'd say anything else, but the man just stared at the flickering screen, his face unmoving. Aaron left, water dripping from his clothes onto the cracked tile. Room 6 was around the back. The corridor was dimly lit, the single bulb above his door barely flickering to life as he approached. The key stuck in the lock, and it took several tries before the door creaked open. The room was what he expected. Outdated, musty, and cold. The bed was covered in a thin, itchy blanket. A single chair sat under the window, and the bathroom door hung slightly ajar, the mirror inside cracked through the middle. The TV looked like it hadn't worked in years. He dropped his bag by the bed and sat down. The mattress let out a groan beneath him. Outside, the rain pounded against the window in waves. For a few minutes, he just listened to it, letting the sound fill the silence. Then he lay back, too tired to care about how uncomfortable the bed was. It was the knocking that woke him. At first, he thought it was part of a dream, but then it came again. 3 soft knocks on the wall behind the headboard. Not the door, the wall. He sat up, heart quickening. Knock, knock, knock. He turned and stared at the wall. There was nothing unusual about it, just faded wallpaper with a few water stains near the top. But the knocks kept coming, soft and deliberate. He pressed his ear to the wall. On the other side should have been room 5. He didn't remember seeing anyone else check in. There hadn't been any other cars in the lot. He stood and walked outside, the cold air hitting him like a wave. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. Room 5's window was dark, and the curtain drawn. He knocked once on the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Aaron pressed his ear to the door. He thought he heard something, a shuffle maybe, but it was hard to tell. He stepped back and returned to his room, shutting the door behind him. He turned the lock and slid the flimsy chain across. That's when he noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The sharp, cloying scent of rot, like meat left out in the sun. It seemed to be coming from the bathroom. He approached slowly, each step echoing in the tiny room. He pushed the door open and flicked on the light. Nothing. The sink was stained, the mirror cracked, and the shower curtain drawn. The smell was stronger now. He reached out and pulled the curtain aside. Empty. No water, no stains, no source for the smell. He shook his head, convinced his mind was playing tricks on him, and splashed cold water on his face. Back in bed, he lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. At 3:12 a.m., the phone rang. The shrill, jarring sound of the old rotary phone beside the bed made him jump. He picked it up. Hello? Nothing. Hello? Then he heard it. Breathing. Slow. Wet. He slammed the receiver down and stared at it, the silence now somehow louder than the ring had been. He unplugged the phone. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. By dawn, the rain had stopped. Pale light leaked through the curtain, and Aaron didn't bother showering or checking out. He grabbed his bag and left, locking the door behind him out of habit. He passed room 5 on his way out. The door was slightly ajar. He paused. Something was on the ground near the threshold. A shoe. It was a child's shoe, small, pink, with a dirty white sole. He bent to pick it up, then thought better of it. He looked into the room. It was empty. No furniture, no bedding, not even a curtain on the window. Just a bare, concrete floor and stained walls. He stepped back, uneasy, and walked quickly to the office. The old man was gone. The counter empty, the TV still flickering with static. A layer of dust covered everything, including the phone, which had been ripped from the wall. Aaron left the key on the counter and stepped outside. But when he looked at the parking lot, his car was gone. He stood frozen. He ran back through the lot, thinking he must have parked somewhere else. Maybe around the side, but there was nothing. Just cracked pavement and overgrown weeds. Then he heard it. A knock. He turned toward the sound. It came from the office. 3 knocks, from behind the wall. He backed away, shaking. He turned and ran toward the road. After about a mile, a passing truck picked him up. The driver was a gruff man in his 50s who said he hadn't seen any motel along the stretch Aaron described. Aaron insisted, told him about the old man, the room, the phone call. The driver just shook his head. Son, I've been hauling on this road for 20 years. Closest motel is a good 30 miles east. Nothing out here but old farmland and trees. Aaron didn't respond. He just stared out the window, watching the highway roll by. That was 3 months ago. He never found his car. The police didn't believe his story. They said he probably got turned around, maybe had a breakdown and wandered off. But sometimes, late at night, he dreams of the motel. He dreams of the knock on the wall, the shoe, the smell. He wakes up to find dirt under his fingernails, mud on his boots, once even a small pink shoe print on his bedroom floor. And every morning at 3:12 a.m., his phone rings. He never answers it. But the voicemail it leaves is always the same. 3 knocks. Story the end.
Story number 6.
Michael and his sister Jenna had been on the road for 12 hours when the rain finally caught up to them. It hadn't been in the forecast, but the storm came anyway, a heavy downpour with wind that made the trees bow and the car's headlights all but useless. They were headed to visit their aunt in a remote town 2 states away, some belated family obligation they couldn't really escape. The plan had been to stop overnight somewhere around the halfway point. Jenna, who'd been in charge of planning, picked out a few decent options online. Franchise hotels, predictable and clean, but the rain ruined everything. The exit they needed was closed for construction, and the detour led them down winding back roads without signals, where signs were scarce and cell reception was patchy at best. It was just after 10 p.m. when they saw the sign for a place called Sunset Pines Motel. A glowing orange vacancy sign buzzed under a sagging canopy. The motel looked like it hadn't been renovated since the late 70s. An L-shaped layout, rooms facing the lot, each with a faded number on the door and a porch light dimmed by decades of grime. They pulled in, rain hammering the windshield. The office light was on. Jenna stayed in the car while Michael ran inside. The bell over the door gave a weak jingle. A woman appeared behind the counter almost instantly, like she'd been standing just out of sight the whole time. She was middle-aged, thin, with tightly curled hair and lipstick so red it almost looked painted on with a marker. "Just 1 room," Michael said, pushing wet hair out of his face. "Do you have anything with 2 beds?" The woman stared at him for a few seconds longer than was comfortable before speaking. "Yes, number 6, 50 for the night, cash." He handed her the money. She slid a key across the counter without asking for ID. "Don't open the window." He blinked. "Excuse me?" Her eyes didn't leave his. "People see things out here. The woods mess with your mind." Michael tried to smile. "Right? Got it." Back in the car, Jenna raised an eyebrow when he told her about the warning. "Creepy," she said. "But whatever, it's just for a night." Room 6 was in the middle of the row. Inside, the carpet was musty and soft from decades of use. The beds were uneven, mattresses sagging like no one had flipped them in years. The window had heavy curtains that looked like they'd never been washed. Jenna turned on the bathroom light and made a face. "Gross," she called. "Everything in here's damp." Michael didn't care. He flopped on the bed closest to the window and let out a long sigh. "As long as there's no murder clown hiding in the closet, I'll manage." They watched TV for a bit, reruns of some reality show on a fuzzy channel, until Jenna fell asleep curled up in her hoodie. Michael tried to follow, but something about the room unsettled him. He couldn't place it. It wasn't the smell or the ancient hum of the air conditioning, it was the silence outside. Total silence. No rain, no wind, no crickets, no frogs, just stillness. He got up and pulled the curtain back just an inch, careful not to open the window. At first, he saw only the parking lot. The storm had passed, leaving behind mist that clung low to the ground. The trees behind the motel were motionless, thick with shadow. Then something moved. It was at the edge of the trees, a figure. Tall, motionless. It wasn't walking, it was just standing there, too still to be anything natural. Michael let the curtain fall shut. He told himself it was a tree, a branch, a trick of the fog. He crawled back into bed and turned off the TV. At 3:12 a.m., something tapped on the window. Not a knock, a tap, delicate, like a single finger. Michael sat up straight in bed. Jenna stirred but didn't wake. Tap, tap, tap. He stared at the curtain. The warning echoed in his head. Don't open the window. But curiosity clawed at him. He stood up and moved toward it. Not opening, just peeking. He gently parted the curtain a crack. There was nothing there. The lot was empty. The fog had thickened. But just as he turned away, he noticed something. A smudge. A handprint on the glass. From the outside. Michael backed away slowly and sat down again. Jenna woke up about 20 minutes later. "Why are you just sitting there?" she mumbled. "Something was at the window." She frowned. "Like what?" "I don't know. Just stay away from it, okay?" Jenna didn't argue. She pulled the blanket higher and went back to sleep. The rest of the night dragged. Michael couldn't sleep. He watched the window until the sky began to lighten. When morning came, they packed quickly. At the front desk, the woman from the night before wasn't there. Instead, an old man in overalls sat behind the counter reading a newspaper. "Checking out?" he asked. Michael nodded. "Is the owner around?" "That'd be me." Michael frowned. "There was a woman here last night." The man gave him a puzzled look. "I haven't had help in years." He turned the paper toward Michael. The front page was yellowed and old. The date was from 1989. "Sir," Michael said, trying to keep his voice calm, "last night, someone gave me the key to room 6. The man looked at him for a long moment, then leaned in slightly. "No one stayed in room 6 since the fire." Michael felt his stomach drop. "What fire?" "Back in 92. Gas leak. Burned half the place down. Room 6 caught the worst of it. Man and his sister, I could have friend for dinner. Never made it out." Michael couldn't speak. "You sure you stayed there?" the man asked. Michael turned and walked out without answering. They got back in the car and drove off in silence. 10 miles down the road, they pulled over at a diner for breakfast. Michael went to use the restroom while Jenna ordered coffee. When he came back, her face was pale. She was holding something. It was a motel key. Room 6, still damp with fog. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I had been driving for what seemed like days, and the fatigue was starting to settle deep into my bones. My usual route through the back roads was taking me from Chicago to Texas, and the GPS kept cutting in and out of service. The road stretched out before me, an endless ribbon of asphalt, and nothing but dark, empty fields on either side. My eyes were starting to blur from the exhaustion, and I was nearing the point where I couldn't keep my eyes open much longer. I just needed a place to sleep, a small, simple stop for the night before I continued my trip the next morning. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I saw the sign. It flickered in the distance, almost like it was calling to me. Greenview Motel, it read in old, faded neon. The soft glow of the sign was the only light in sight for miles. I made the decision almost instinctively. I turned off the main road, the gravel crunching under my tires as I followed the narrow path that led to the motel. As I drove down the narrow road, I could see the motel in front of me. It was an old, one-story building, the kind you don't see anymore. The paint on the building was chipped and peeling, and the windows were clouded with age. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few cars scattered in front of the rooms. The air smelled of damp wood, and the silence was almost suffocating. I pulled up to the front office and killed the engine. The small, flickering light above the office door cast an eerie glow across the building. I took a deep breath and walked toward the door. Inside, the office was dimly lit, and the air smelled like stale coffee and dust. Behind the counter stood an older man, his eyes pale and unblinking, watching me as I entered. His hair was thin and gray, his face lined with years of hard living. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with a strange, unreadable expression. "Need a room?" he finally asked, his voice rough like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep the wariness out of my voice. "Just for the night." He looked at me for a long moment, then grabbed a key from behind the counter. It was attached to a faded wooden tag with the number 7 scratched into it. The man slid the key across the counter to me without a word. His fingers were long and bony, his skin pale and dry. I tried to smile, but something about his cold demeanor made it difficult. "Room 7, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the last one at the end." I nodded and took the key. Without another word, the man turned away and returned to whatever he had been doing before I walked in. I left the office and made my way to the room. The walkway to room 7 was dark, and the only sounds I could hear were the crunching of my boots on the gravel and the occasional rustling of leaves in the trees. The building seemed older the closer I got. The exterior lights flickered intermittently, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. I felt a strange sense of unease, but brushed it off as my tired mind playing tricks on me. When I reached the door to room 7, I noticed that the key was heavier than I expected. As I inserted it into the lock, I heard a faint scratching sound, like something was moving inside the room. It sent a chill up my spine, but I forced myself to push the door open. The room was small, but not uncomfortable. The bed was covered with a floral-patterned blanket that had seen better days, and the air smelled stale, like old furniture and mildew. The fluorescent light overhead flickered briefly before settling into a dull hum. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the carpet was threadbare, worn down from years of use. There was a small desk by the window, and the window itself was covered with thick, heavy curtains that blocked out any light from the outside. I tossed my bag on the bed and began to unpack. As I unpacked my clothes, I heard a strange sound from the bathroom, a faint, persistent dripping, like water falling into a sink. I turned to the bathroom door, which was ajar, and for a moment I just stared at it. The sound grew louder, and a sense of dread started to creep over me. I stood there frozen for a moment, debating whether or not I should check it out. Finally, I walked over and opened the bathroom door. The light was on, but the bathroom was empty. The sink was dry. There was no water running, and yet the dripping sound continued, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. I stepped inside cautiously, my heart racing as I looked around the small space. The floor was covered with a thin layer of dust, and the mirror above the sink was fogged, as if someone had just taken a shower. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. I turned to leave, but just as I was about to step back into the main room, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the mirror. A shadow, dark and thin, moving quickly across the room behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the bathroom was empty. Nothing was there. I backed out of the bathroom, my mind racing. My body was trembling, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I slammed the bathroom door shut and locked it. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to calm myself down. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I had just convinced myself it was nothing, that I was just overtired, when there was a knock at the door. I froze. My mind went blank for a moment, and then the knock came again. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was testing the door to see if anyone was inside. I approached the door cautiously, my hand gripping the handle. I peered through the peephole but saw nothing. Just darkness. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened the door. There was no one there. I stepped outside and looked down the hallway. The motel was silent. The lights in the other rooms were off, and the parking lot was still. I was alone. I shut the door quickly, locking it behind me. Something about this place felt wrong, off in a way I couldn't explain. But my exhaustion was starting to take its toll, and I knew I wouldn't get any sleep if I didn't calm down. I lay down on the bed, pulling the covers up around me, and tried to force myself to relax. But every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing the dripping sound again. At some point, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke up with a start to the sound of something scraping against the door. I shot up in bed, my breath shallow and fast. The scraping continued, rhythmic and persistent, like something or someone was trying to get in. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the door, peering through the peephole again. This time I saw something, a figure. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the shadows. It stood just outside my door, unmoving. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt its gaze like it was burning through the door. I took a step back, panic rising in my chest. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone on the nightstand. I had to call for help. I had to get out of there. But when I picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone. The phone was dead. I turned to look around the room. Everything was still. The dripping sound had stopped. The scraping at the door ceased. I was alone. I ran to the window, but when I opened the curtains, the parking lot outside was empty. The sign for the motel was dark now, and there were no lights from the other rooms. I realized then that the motel wasn't just a place to rest. It was a trap. Something about this place had twisted it into a living thing. I could feel it pressing in on me, its weight on my chest. I backed away from the window and turned toward the door. I had to leave. I had to get out. But when I reached for the handle, the door wouldn't open. It was stuck, as if something had blocked it from the outside. I banged on the door, desperate, but no one came. There was no escape. As I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face, I realized that the motel had claimed me. It always claimed its guests. There were no exits, no way out. The green neon sign flickered one last time, and then the lights went out completely. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I was driving down a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple and the landscape swallowed by darkness. My phone was dead, no service in sight. The nearest town was about an hour's drive, and I had been on the road for hours with no real destination in mind. I just needed somewhere to sleep. I had been through plenty of long road trips, but this was different. My thoughts kept swirling, mostly about work, about life. And then, just as I was about to give up on finding a place to rest for the night, I saw the sign, a weathered, dimly lit placard that read Lone Pine Motel. It was small, and from the look of it, it hadn't seen much attention in years, but it was a place to stop, so I pulled in. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a single sedan parked near the farthest room. The place was quiet, eerily so, and the whole building seemed to sag under the weight of time. I could hear the faint hum of the neon sign buzzing in the background as I grabbed my things and walked toward the front office. The office door was slightly ajar. I knocked, and the door creaked open. Inside, the smell of stale air and old coffee greeted me. Behind the counter was a woman who looked to be in her early 60s. Her hair was silver, tied back in a tight bun. She was wearing a faded floral dress, and she didn't seem particularly surprised to see me. "Looking for a room?" she asked, her voice thick with a southern drawl. "Yeah, just for the night," I said. "How much?" $50 for the night," she replied, not even asking for my ID or any information. It felt a little strange, but I was too tired to care. I handed her the money, and she slid a key across the counter to me. "Room 5, she said, her eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer than normal. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need. We don't get many travelers around here." I gave her a quick nod and walked out. As I made my way to the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but, again, I was too exhausted to dwell on it. The motel looked like something out of the past, a relic from the 50s, maybe 60s, with faded blue and white paint, and each room had a small window with heavy curtains drawn shut. Room 5 was the second from the end, and I unlocked the door with the rusty key. The room was small, but it had what I needed: a bed, a desk, and a small bathroom. The sheets on the bed were wrinkled, but appeared clean enough. I set my bag down and flopped onto the bed, already feeling my eyelids grow heavy. It was too late to explore the town, and frankly, I wasn't in the mood for anything more than a few hours of sleep. As I lay there, I couldn't help but hear the strange creaking of the floorboards in the room above me. It wasn't rhythmic like footsteps, more like random shifting, but it was loud enough to be noticed. I told myself it was nothing, just the settling of an old building. After a few minutes, I began to drift off, but then something else caught my attention. It was the sound of someone crying. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder. It sounded like a woman, her sobs sharp and broken. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding, listening intently. I could hear it clearly now, like someone was right outside my door. I pulled myself out of bed and walked cautiously to the door. I pressed my ear to the thin wood, trying to pinpoint the sound. There was nothing, only silence. My heart rate returned to normal, and I chalked it up to my imagination. It wasn't uncommon for my mind to play tricks on me when I was this tired. I went back to bed, but as soon as I closed my eyes, the crying started again. Only this time, it was louder and closer. I sat up in bed and looked around the room. The noise didn't seem to be coming from outside. It was coming from the walls. At first, I thought it might be plumbing or some sort of old pipes, but this was different. The crying was too distinct, too human. I reached for the phone by the bed and dialed the office. The line rang a few times before someone picked up. Lone Pine Motel, the voice said, groggy. I don't know if there's a problem with the plumbing, but I keep hearing someone crying. Is there a woman staying here? The voice on the other end was silent for a moment before the woman's voice came back, low and clipped. Everything's fine, honey. You just get some rest now. I felt uneasy, but I thanked her and hung up. I tried to lie back down, but the sound of crying continued, now accompanied by a faint tapping sound, soft but persistent, almost like nails on a surface. It was as if someone or something was scratching at the walls, trying to get through. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and rushed out of the room. My feet hit the cold concrete of the parking lot, and I walked quickly toward the office. My heart was racing. I had to talk to the woman. I had to get out of there. When I reached the office, I knocked, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time. No response. I turned and looked back at the dark, quiet rooms. I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me, but then something caught my eye. In the corner of the parking lot, near the last room, I saw a faint figure standing by the window. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a woman, her face pressed against the glass, her hands resting on the windowsill. I blinked, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to be here anymore. I turned to leave when the office door suddenly creaked open. The woman was standing there, her thin face pale under the dim light. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there staring at me. Then, finally, she spoke. "You're not the first," she said, her voice strangely detached. "People come and go. They always do. But some stay." Her words sent a shiver through me. What did she mean by that? Before I could ask, she stepped back into the office, leaving the door wide open. I had no choice but to follow. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single overhead light, casting long shadows across the walls. The air was thick with the smell of old cigarettes and stale coffee. The woman was standing behind the counter, her hands folded in front of her. "Who stays?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't look at me as she spoke, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. "People who don't leave," she said. "They come here looking for rest, but they don't find it. The motel takes them. It needs them." I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. The room felt heavier now, like it was closing in on me. I couldn't breathe. The silence was overwhelming, and the air was thick with something I couldn't identify. "Stay here," she said suddenly, as if reading my mind. "Stay long enough, and you'll understand, but you have to be careful." I didn't wait for her to say anything else. I turned and bolted out the door back to my car. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I never went back to the Lone Pine Motel, and I never will. Every now and then I still hear the faint sound of crying in my mind, and I can't help but wonder if there are others like me who are still trapped there, trapped in a place that takes what it needs and never lets go. Story. The end.
Story number 9.
I had been driving for what felt like an eternity. The dark stretches of the highway blurred by the constant drizzle that had plagued me for hours. I was on my way to a town I didn't know, following a GPS that kept cutting in and out. The roads were empty, and there was only the hum of my car's engine and the occasional flicker of lights from the overhead street lamps. The gas gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty when I spotted it, a sign for a motel. It flickered intermittently, the words "Sunset Motel Vacancy" glowing in the fog. The sign itself looked old, the paint chipped and faded, but the dim light felt like a beacon in the storm. I had no choice. I needed to stop for the night, rest a bit, and get back on the road early the next morning. I pulled off the highway and drove down a narrow, winding road that led to the motel. The parking lot was small and nearly empty. A few cars were parked in the spaces closest to the office, but the rest of the lot was filled with weeds and cracked pavement. There was a lone street lamp flickering near the entrance, casting long shadows across the area. The whole place looked like it hadn't seen a good cleaning in years. I stepped out of the car and hurried inside. The bell above the door jangled loudly, and a chill ran down my spine as I entered the dimly lit office. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke, mold, and something faintly sweet, like old flowers. Behind the counter sat a woman who couldn't have been more than 40, though her face was lined with age and hard living. Her blonde hair hung in limp strands, and her eyes seemed distant, like she wasn't fully present in the room. She gave me a vacant smile. "You looking for a room?" she asked, her voice slow and gravelly. I nodded. "Just for the night, please. I'm on a long drive." She handed me a key without a word. The key was old, metal with a heavy, faded plastic tag attached. It read, Room 7. No further instructions, no small talk. She simply turned her attention back to the ledger in front of her, barely acknowledging me. I wasn't sure why, but I felt uneasy. I turned and made my way out of the office, the door creaking shut behind me. Room 7 was a little further down the row of rooms, tucked away toward the back. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the occasional gust of wind made the trees rustle eerily in the distance. The air felt damp, cold, unnaturally so. The door to my room didn't have a doorknob. Instead, it had a simple metal latch that you had to pull to open. I hesitated for a moment, but pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room wasn't much better than the outside. The walls were cracked and stained with age. The bed was covered with an old faded quilt, the sheets wrinkled and uninviting. A single lamp sat on the nightstand, casting an uneven light that barely illuminated the room. The floor was hardwood but warped, and there was a musty, damp smell that lingered in the air. I threw my bag on the bed and took a moment to sit down, rubbing my tired eyes. It was clear that this place had seen better days. Still, it was somewhere to sleep, and I didn't feel like driving any longer. I decided to take a shower before I went to bed, hoping it might help me relax. The bathroom was small, with peeling wallpaper and a tub that like it hadn't been cleaned in ages. The water temperature was difficult to regulate, going from hot to cold in an instant, but I didn't mind too much. After the long drive, I just wanted to wash off the road grime and get some sleep. When I stepped out of the shower, the bathroom light flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I reached for a towel and dried off, then wrapped it around my waist. I noticed something strange in the mirror, a faint mark on the glass. I leaned in, squinting at it. It looked like a handprint, but it was smeared, as though someone had pressed their palm against the mirror and then dragged it down. I wiped the glass with my towel, but the mark didn't come off. I frowned and left the bathroom. The feeling of unease had only grown stronger. I wasn't sure why, but the whole place felt wrong. The silence was oppressive. No sounds of traffic, no other guests moving about, no life. Just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. I climbed into bed and tried to push the strange feeling out of my mind. It wasn't much different from any other cheap motel I'd stayed at on the road, but sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a noise. At first, I thought I had imagined it, a soft, scratching sound coming from the wall. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound came again. It was like something, or someone, was dragging their nails across the wall. I shivered, my heart racing in my chest. The sound was coming from the adjacent room, which I knew was room 6. I wasn't sure what to do. It didn't make sense. The place had seemed so deserted. I had assumed there were no other guests here. Still, I lay there in bed, listening intently, trying to figure out what was going on. The sound stopped after a few minutes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got up, grabbed my shoes, and went to the door. The hallway outside was silent, the air cold and damp. I glanced over at the door to room 6, half expecting it to be open. But it was locked, and the light under the door was off. I couldn't see anything through the tiny peephole, but there was something unsettling about the darkness. I stood there for a while, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, I heard a door creak open from the room next to mine. I turned quickly, startled, but no one appeared. I held my breath, waiting. Then, just as suddenly, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I waited for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear them, slow, deliberate footsteps moving down the hall, closer to my room. I froze. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, without warning, the doorknob turned. My blood ran cold. I backed away from the door slowly, not knowing what to do. There was no sound of anyone entering, no creak of the floorboards, no murmur of voices, just silence. I reached for the phone on the nightstand and dialed the front desk, my hand shaking as I pressed the numbers. The line rang for several seconds before someone picked up. "Hello," it was the woman from earlier. "There's someone in the hall," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think they're at my door." There was a long pause. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, she spoke. "There's no one else here, dear." "But I heard footsteps," I protested. "Someone was at my door." "I'm sure it's nothing," she replied, her voice calm, almost too calm. "Get some sleep." I didn't argue. I hung up the phone and tried to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. By the time morning came, the rain had stopped and the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. I was exhausted, but I couldn't wait to leave. When I left the room and stepped outside, the parking lot was empty, save for my car. I glanced over at room 6 once more. The door was shut tight, but something about it seemed off. As I walked past, I caught a glimpse of something through the window, a figure standing in the dark room, watching me. I quickly turned away, making my way to the office to check out. The woman was sitting behind the counter, staring at the TV. I handed her the key without saying a word, but before I left, I couldn't resist. I turned back and asked, "Who was in room 6? She didn't even glance up at me. "No one," she said. "It's been empty for years." I didn't say anything else. I just turned and left, feeling a strange shiver run down my spine. I never found out what happened in that room. But to this day, every time I drive along that stretch of road, I can't help but glance over at the motel. Sometimes when I do, I swear I see someone standing in the window of room 6, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I had been on the road for hours, the monotonous hum of the tires against the highway lulling me into a sense of numbness. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the landscape in an eerie twilight that seemed to stretch on forever. I didn't mind the solitude, but as the darkness enveloped the world around me, a gnawing feeling started to creep in. I was exhausted, my body aching from sitting in the car for so long, and I knew I needed to find a place to rest before I fell asleep at the wheel. Then, through the fog of my exhaustion, I saw it, a faded sign that read, "Whistling Pines Motel." It was just off the road, tucked between a couple of trees, barely visible except for the weak glow of a single bulb above the office. There were no other cars in sight, no other signs of life. Just the motel, standing like an isolated relic from the past. I slowed the car and pulled into the gravel parking lot. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as I made my way to the front office. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen a motel this old, this remote. The office door was slightly ajar, and a bell above it jingled as I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the cold. The room was freezing, despite the warm night outside. The air had a musty, stale scent, as though the building had been closed for years. Behind the counter, a man looked up at me. He had the kind of face that made it hard to guess his age. His features were sharp, but his skin had the texture of someone who had spent too much time exposed to the elements. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Yeah, just for the night," I replied, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. The man didn't speak again. He simply reached beneath the counter, grabbed a key, and slid it across to me. The key had a large, rusted tag with the number 9 scratched into it. The man's eyes lingered on mine for a moment longer than I was comfortable with, but I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just tired. "Room 9, he said finally. "Last one on the left. You'll be fine. Just don't go out after dark." His words hung in the air like a strange warning, but I nodded, not wanting to seem rude. I grabbed the key and headed toward the door, stepping back into the cool night air. The motel wasn't much, a row of small rooms, each with a flickering light outside the door. The building was old, its paint peeling and windows clouded with age. As I made my way down the narrow path to room 9, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around, but there was no one else in sight. The other rooms were dark, and the silence was suffocating. When I reached the door, I unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was cramped, with a single bed covered in faded floral sheets, a small dresser, and a TV from the 1980s that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The air inside was colder than outside, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the walls. The fluorescent light above buzzed intermittently, casting strange shadows across the room. I tossed my bag on the bed and sat down, exhausted. The fatigue of the long drive was starting to catch up with me, and I decided I'd rest for a few hours before continuing on. I turned off the light and lay back on the bed, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. The motel was quiet, too quiet. I couldn't hear a single sound from outside, not even the usual hum of insects or the rustling of leaves in the wind. I closed my eyes and tried to ignore the cold, the unsettling atmosphere. But then I heard something, a faint sound coming from the other side of the room. It was almost imperceptible at first, like the soft scrape of furniture moving against the floor. I sat up, my heart starting to race. The noise stopped as soon as I moved, but the silence that followed was worse. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel a cold chill creeping over my skin. I got up and moved toward the window, peering out into the darkness. The parking lot was empty, but I noticed something odd. There was a figure standing by the tree line. It was difficult to make out any details in the darkness, but it was tall and thin, almost unnaturally so. The figure was just standing there, unmoving, staring at the motel. I blinked, and when I looked back, it was gone. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach. My exhaustion was starting to cloud my judgment. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. I lay back down on the bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, the silence pressing in on me like a weight. Then I heard it again, a soft sound like something brushing against the door. At first it was just a faint noise, but it grew louder, more distinct, the sound of nails scraping against wood. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. I stared at the door, trying to figure out if I was imagining things. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, as though someone or something was trying to get in. I stood up and walked toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. But just before I touched it, the sound stopped. Silence. I hesitated for a moment before slowly opening the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The air outside was cold, and the light from the motel flickered weakly against the darkness. There was nothing in the hallway, no one else in sight. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, my body trembling with adrenaline. I glanced around the room, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on me. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave. The motel was isolated, and the nearest town was too far to reach before morning. I had no choice but to try to get some sleep, though I knew it wouldn't come easily. I turned the light back on and sat down at the small desk in the corner, trying to calm my mind. I stared at the old lamp on the desk, the faint hum of the fluorescent light above my head mingling with the strange silence outside. That's when I heard it again, a soft, scraping noise, followed by a faint tapping. It was coming from the far corner of the room, from the closet. I stood up, my heart in my throat. Slowly, I approached the closet, my breath shallow. The noise was louder now, like something was moving inside, scratching at the walls. I reached for the door and pulled it open. The closet was empty. I stared inside, my mind racing. There was nothing there, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. My skin crawled. I slammed the door shut and backed away, not wanting to be anywhere near it. Suddenly I heard a noise from outside the room. The distinct sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. Someone was walking along the hallway, just outside my door. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I was about to open the door and confront whoever it was when the footsteps stopped. I waited for a few seconds, then cracked the door open just enough to look outside. The hallway was empty. I stepped out, my eyes darting down the dark corridor. There was no one there, no sign of movement, nothing but the silence. But then I saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, standing at the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. The figure was watching me, unmoving, its face hidden in the darkness. I couldn't breathe. My body went numb, and I felt a chill run through me as the figure began to move toward me slowly and steadily. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I backed away, stumbling over the edge of the bed. My mind was racing. What the hell was going on? Who was that? I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my things and rushed out of the room, running down the gravel path to my car. I didn't look back as I sped out of the parking lot, the headlights casting long shadows across the empty motel. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, and my mind kept replaying the image of that figure standing in the hallway, watching me. I never went back to Whistling Pines Motel. I don't know what I saw that night or who or what was in that building, but I'm sure of one thing, I wasn't alone. Story the end.
Story number 11.
I had been driving for hours, the monotonous hum of the highway stretching endlessly before me. It had been a long week, and the road felt like the only thing that would give me a sense of relief. I was heading through a stretch of country that seemed far removed from civilization. The only company I had was the occasional truck speeding past and the deep, unnerving silence that filled the spaces between. The sun had set, leaving only the dim glow of my headlights to guide me. The headlights flickered, casting odd shadows over the trees and fields. I had passed through a few small towns earlier, but nothing had caught my attention. As I glanced at my phone, I realized that I hadn't seen a gas station for miles. I checked the GPS, but it wasn't much help. The map looked outdated, the roads unfamiliar. I wasn't worried yet, but the reality of the situation was setting in. I needed to find a place to stay before I drove into complete darkness. I hadn't seen any motels or inns since I'd left the last town, so when a small neon sign flashed ahead, I was almost relieved. It read, Eagle's Rest Motel. I pulled off the road into the gravel parking lot, my tires crunching against the stones as I parked. The motel looked old, but not abandoned. The building was a single-story structure with a few cars scattered across the lot. A flickering sign above the office entrance buzzed loudly in the still night air. The whole place felt trapped in time, a relic of a bygone era. The fluorescent light above the office glared down at me, illuminating the aging brick exterior in a cold, unforgiving way. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and walked up to the office door. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The air smelled musty, tinged with a faint odor of stale cigarettes and something else. Something harder to place, but it immediately made me uncomfortable. The office was dimly lit, the light from the sign outside casting an eerie glow through the window. Behind the counter, an older man sat, his face hidden in shadow. He looked up at me slowly as I entered. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken deep into his face, as though he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His clothes were outdated, and his movements were slow, deliberate. "Need a room?" he asked in a voice that was rough, almost raspy, as if he hadn't spoken in days. I nodded. "Just for the night." He gestured to a key hanging on the wall behind him, the brass tag gleaming in the dim light. "Room 8, just down the hall. Don't go past that room, though. The other end, it's not safe." I raised an eyebrow, taken aback by his odd comment. "Not safe? What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he grabbed the key, his fingers slow and deliberate as he handed it to me. "Just stay in room 8. You'll be fine. No need to go exploring." I felt a chill run down my spine. The man's eyes didn't leave mine as I took the key, and for a moment I wondered if I had made a mistake pulling in here. But I needed sleep, and it seemed like the only option for miles. I thanked him and walked out of the office, my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. The parking lot was quiet now, save for the distant hum of the highway. I glanced over at the other rooms, noticing that most of the lights were off. There were a few cars parked in front of the rooms, but the whole place had an abandoned feel to it, like it had seen better days. Room 8 was located at the far end of the building, near a patch of trees that bordered the motel. The rain had started lightly, the drops tapping softly against the pavement as I walked to the door. The key slid easily into the lock, and the door creaked open. The room inside was small, and the air felt stale, as though it had been closed off for too long. The wallpaper was yellowed with age, and the furniture was old but functional. The bed was covered with a thick, patterned quilt, and the dresser had a few chips in the wood. The window was cracked open slightly, the sound of the rain outside mixing with the distant rustling of the trees. I set my bag down and went to the bathroom, hoping to freshen up a bit. The bathroom was small but functional, with peeling tiles and a mirror that had cracks running through it. I turned on the shower, letting the hot water wash over me, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had been creeping up on me since I arrived. When I returned to the room, I noticed something strange. The light above the bed flickered briefly before going out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I frowned, wondering if the bulb had blown. I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, but before I could turn it on, I heard a soft thud, like something had dropped to the floor. I froze. There was no one else in the room. The door had been locked behind me when I entered. I glanced around, trying to see if something had fallen off the nightstand or if I had knocked something over without realizing it. But the room was as still as it had been before. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before I forced myself to sit on the edge of the bed. I tried to calm my nerves, reminding myself that it was probably just the house settling. But there was something in the air now, something heavy, something watching. The quiet was broken by another thud, louder this time. It came from the corner of the room, near the window. I jumped up, my mind racing. The sound of the rain outside mixed with the unsettling noise inside, making it hard to distinguish one from the other. I walked slowly toward the corner, my eyes scanning the room. There was nothing there, no sign of movement, no indication that anything had fallen. But then I noticed something on the floor. A small piece of paper, folded in half, lay just beneath the window. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, hurried, and the ink seemed to be smudged in places, as though it had been written in a rush. It read, "Get out. They're watching you. Don't go to room 7. A chill ran through me as I stared at the note. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my hands went cold. What did this mean? Who had left this here, and why? I looked around the room again, but there was no one. The door was still locked, and there was no way anyone could have entered without me hearing them. I shoved the note into my pocket, trying to dismiss it as the ramblings of a previous guest. Maybe someone had been staying in this room before me, and they had written the note in a panic, but the feeling of unease only deepened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with this place. I needed to sleep. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me and that I'd be fine in the morning. I turned the light back on, and as soon as the bulb flickered to life, I saw it, just for a brief moment, moving in the corner of my vision. A shadow, tall and thin, standing by the window. I whipped my head around, but the room was empty. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly backed away from the window. I felt trapped, as though the walls were closing in around me, and the oppressive silence was too much to bear. I didn't know what was going on, but I had to leave. I grabbed my bag and rushed out of the room, heading toward the parking lot. But when I reached the lot, I froze. The parking lot was empty. The cars were gone. The motel, it seemed, was deserted. I turned around, running back toward room 8, desperate to find someone, anyone. But when I reached the door, I found it locked. The lights inside had gone out, and the sound of the wind rustling in the trees was the only noise left in the still night. There was no one here, no one but me. I turned and ran, not looking back, not daring to look back. I don't know how far I ran, but when I reached the main road, I found myself standing in front of an old diner. I walked in, breathless and terrified, and the woman behind the counter looked at me, her expression unfazed. "You came from the Eagle's Rest Motel?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, my heart racing. She shook her head. "That place is long abandoned. No one stayed there in years." Story the end.